Hey everybody, I'm Eric Airlock, and this is another talk on Greek philosophy and Plato's Republic, one of the central texts that is often examined and studied in Greek philosophy. So of course, we are going to spend not much time on it at all. It's not worthy of our attention. I am just kidding. But one of the things, as I have unfortunately been saying all too often in the talks lately with Buddhist and Greek philosophy, which is what I'm doing both of this semester, not together, two different classes, is something I learned in grad school is the Plato's Republic gets a lot of attention, and other dialogues of Plato, which are also important, don't get as much. Now, we just covered the Symposium. The Symposium, as mentioned, is possibly Plato's best play. It has a real kick at the end, and it is very early Socrates. But as I have been mentioning, according to scholars, and I follow their lead, and there are different interpretations, of course, as there should be, but Plato seems to have early and later dialogues, and the turning point of Plato's dialogues, and that does make the Republic a bit important, from Book 1 to Book 2 and the rest of the Republic seems to be Plato's turn from his early to his later period, and from his early character of Socrates to his later character of Socrates in his plays, his dialogues, and Plato's philosophy is written in dialogue form. Much as early Greek thought was written in song or poetry, as is in philosophy and wisdom tales the world over, you find that Plato is writing his, and Aristotle wrote dialogues which are lost, and in fact Aristotle's works may be his students' lecture notes, we are not sure. You find in the form of art, Plato putting forward philosophy. He has early Socrates, who sounds decent enough like Heraclitus, what the bleep do any of us know? And I go around questioning everybody, and nobody knows anything, no matter what specialists there are. He says a doctor and a lawyer at the Symposium. Both of them turn out to be kind of full of it. Wine and other intoxicants, it would seem. And so, essentially, what do any of us know, even if we have high position in life, and I can lead a slave boy in the Meno, which we had in the previous dialogue. I can lead a slave boy, an uneducated, illiterate slave boy, possibly northern, possibly southern, of northern or southern lands or complexions. I can lead the uneducated into mathematics and geometry, very much what math was to them, not algebra, or that sort of symbolic notation, which we'll get in here with the representation of elements with basic shapes, which is a fascinating other thing I learned in grad school. I have been telling people all too often, I learned things in grad school. I insist. And it does seem that Plato turns here in the Republic from early to late Socrates, but there are very important texts of Plato that should get more attention, like the Timaeus, which comes next. The Timaeus is Plato's cosmology. It tells you that vegetation is the hair of the world, and a lot of other, what many would say are unscientific things. But then again, Plato never would have used the Latin term scientia. He would have used the word like craft, and you can see sometimes when translators translate, they say craft, and then they say craft and science, and they put it in there, and it does weirdly make it seem like the Greeks distinguished baser crafts from the scientias, when of course they wouldn't have used the word scientia, and that's kind of stuck in there for sometimes a modern audience. Aristotle says crafts and sciences, like boxing and wrestling. Pretty sure, as I like to joke, boxing is not a craft and wrestling a science, but that's partly for a translating or miss or not for Mr. and Mrs. Modern. So, essentially, what Socrates is going to do is early Socrates at Book 1 of the Republic ticks everyone off, telling everybody they know nothing. But then people storm out of the party with one half of the party, and then the other half of the party sticks around and says, now Socrates says, I could have explained that better. And they say, why don't you? And then Socrates turns into later Socrates, later Plato, right here at this hinge. Book 2 of the Republic is then now Socrates turns into, like myself, a lecturer. And he just sits there, not in dialogue, lecturing a lot, and you have the interlocutors say, yes, Socrates, no, Socrates, pretty much yes, Socrates, all the time. Well, I just didn't understand that, Socrates, because that sounds like 10 pounds of reasoning in a 5-pound bag, but I don't understand, like what that meant. So why don't you tell me how right you are? Because I don't get it. And basically it stops being so much of a dialogue and it starts being more of a Pythagorean lecture series about the levels of the city. And then in the next dialogue, which is often not examined along with the Republic, Timaeus comes in as a Pythagorean. He takes over as lecturer. Socrates shuts up, and Timaeus tells us a bunch of Pythagorean things about the tripartite shape of the cosmos. And what do you know? The conversation you had the previous day of the Republic happens to fit the cosmos. So let me tell you all about how the cosmos comes in threes within threes, and Neoplatonism, Plato's legacy, and much of the intellectualism in the Islamic and Middle Age European worlds, leading up to then Descartes breaking from it as modern European philosophy. Descartes is still Platonic and Aristotelian in ways, but Descartes knows he is a break as modern European philosophy, because Platonists and Aristotelians for the longest time believed in the Timaeus, and so did a lot of Muslims, and that makes the Timaeus amazing. That's coming next. But if you don't read the Timaeus and you read Plato's Republic, I oftentimes hear people clip out, I've seen this on Reddit even recently, people will write articles about the Republic, pop pieces, and hey, much love for the pop, and for the average person, availability, but they'll suggest almost like Plato's Republic is an argument for democracy when it is anything but. Plato is not a fan of democracy. He would have seen democracy as a regression towards like Germanic or Viking tribalism or barbaric, kind of African European tribalism. He would not have seen democracy as a balancing act for Aristotle, but as not something you need a good king you need good philosopher, educated philosopher kings. You don't want the rabble having much say upward. Unfortunately, Plato is of that mind. I am not. He certainly is, decently. And there's much argument. So oftentimes people will clip out the cave of Plato's Republic, which is inspiration for the Matrix. Dude, as we'll talk about, whoa, I know Kung Fu, Gong Fu, etc. That essentially, Plato is not arguing with the cave that the average person can be democratic. He is arguing very few of us make it our way out of the cave, and we should listen to Egyptian priests and our solar betters, a la the symposium a bit, and we should listen to Egyptian priests and philosophers tell us what to do, downward. He very much makes that argument in the Republic, and then you find out, oh, that's because that's how the cosmos is shaped, and the gods come downward to us. So all that ain't an accident. All that is quite essential, right in the middle of it, a la Aristotle, Plato's student. And then, unfortunately, not successor. It was Plato's nephew. But we have yet to talk out all of that a bit with Aristotle. So, this is the turning point from early Plato to late Plato in Book 1 to Book 2 of the Republic. But if you read the Republic without the Timaeus, I gotta say, that is one of the things I learned in grad school. I got to take wonderful classes in Neoplatonism, a whole year of it with Mark Delp, who was an advisor for my thesis, which I wrote about Hegel and Neoplatonism. And Hegel says Neoplatonism is the most brilliant thing ever, and it really is true philosophy. And why does he say that? Well, Hegel is himself, as a modern German philosopher, he is very Platonic, but a modern European like Descartes, but very Platonic. And I wrote a bit about that, and I do like all that, which is why while I am not a Platonist, I am a Wittgensteinian, which means in certain ways I am much more the intuitionist and the pragmatist than someone who believes in forms, but fixed forms that are metaphysical. But that all aside, Plato and the history of Plato and Neoplatonism is absolutely amazing. And you really need to not just get bits and pieces of the Republic told to you by American professors as if it's a prequel to American democracy. You should really get the Republic along with the Timaeus and understand Plato thinks vegetation is the hair of the world, much like many cultures. And that to him is, he wouldn't have used the Latin, scientia. Like that is the craft of cosmology. That is what Neil deGrasse Tyson does and did. Like that's basically physics and math to him, that vegetation or mud is a lowly form above the more ordered. He thinks that's all hard science. And you don't get any of that you don't get how his politics of the Republic is trying to line up a set of Russian nesting dolls, a totem pole of not only organs of the body. And I only had to hit the books hard on this once I got to grad school. It's like, no, you really need to know the context of these Greek texts. You can't just snip bits out. And they really press you to that level, oftentimes, and in Greek thought in American philosophy departments, only when you get to grad school, and only then if you take specialist classes in the Greeks, because most of American philosophy in American universities is American analytic philosophy. Even sidelining the Greeks now, let alone anything Indian, and some smattering, slight chance of Chinese. But yeah. Early Plato is definitely saying Heraclitus is right about the world below. But he seems to be transitioning in this text to saying Pythagoras was right about the eternal world above, and guess what? Timaeus, who is a Pythagorean, we are told in the text, is going to come in here and lecture us all, and we're all going to shut up, including Socrates, which, book 2 and onward here, everyone shuts up and listens to Socrates and becomes yes-men interlocutors, and not the cool kind of yes-men weathermen 60s types. They basically just go along, which is the ironic name. They just go along with very much, oh yes, Socrates, that's amazing, Socrates. Confucius says, Yan Hui is of no use to me. Everything I say pleases him. And I always have to make the point. Yes, Socrates, that's great, Socrates. Wait, I don't get the point. Just show me how you're right, Socrates. Unfortunately, Confucius would hate, hopefully, these people. And hopefully didn't hate Yan Hui that much, who is a foil who looks like an idiot several times in the Analects. So, an interlocutor of sorts, and a bad one, as these are too much, but in an opposite way. Plato believed, essentially Heraclitus seems to be right below, but he hates Heraclitus, and he does quite openly in his later texts. He thinks Homer and Heraclitus are on the same team of evil in philosophy, or sophistry, not true philosophy, of course, because everyone who isn't you is a sophist, depending on whatever side you're on. And then it's sort of like, again, everybody's in league with science, the communists, the capitalists, but of course those other people are not, as we race each other into space. Not really, of course. I mean, you know, scientific objectivity, I mean. It's only in one person's camp rather than the other. You know, that kind of all-seeingness of humanity. That as we're feeling the spirit moving through us, a Pythagorean named Timaeus comes in and lectures everybody about how the cosmos is made of math, and then lectures us all about that. Well, that is certainly a turn from early Socrates, because he sounds like Heraclitus, and he sounds like, well, I bug everybody, nobody knows anything, experts are dinks. And then he comes, oh, by the way, let me actually step aside. First, let me lecture you about what seems to be the threefold form of the city. And you know what? I'm going to shut up and let this Pythagorean named Timaeus tell us all about how that's actually the cosmos. Wow, that blows my mind. That just happens to line up with the tuning fork of our conversation yesterday. Must have been right then. Well, that shows you Plato is segging into Pythagoras, as already I mentioned. Please watch the video on Pythagoras. And then he also vaguely wants to hold the door open for Parmenides, that nothing is different and everything is all one. Which, as mentioned with the Please Watch Pythagoras and Parmenides videos and Zeno, oddly, Plato is trying to have his cake and eat it too. He wants that math to be absolutely real, but all is one, kind of in an almost quasi-Buddhistic, Upanishadic Indian way. And it's like, well, wait a minute. And Greek philosophy and Indian philosophy has so many remarkable parallels and crossover positions opposite each other in each culture. It's like, does Plato want all mystically with Buddhism and Parmenides all is one and change is an illusion? But then he also wants math to be the true metaphysical structure of Pythagorean reality. Those two things don't mesh well. But maybe Plato is saying, well, we're foolish mortal human beings, we always have the duck rabbit. That would actually bring him in line with my very Heraclitean Wittgensteinianism and the duck rabbit. So let's get into it. Plato has Socrates argue that those who think they know the world below have mere opinions, but the one who knows the world above, the true eternal pattern of reality, has true knowledge, or at least he does suggest this in the text, and then the Timaeus following, and the next talk will be on that. In Plato's Republic, we find Socrates debating with his fellow Athenian aristocrats, again, on the nature of virtue, justice, and the good itself. And he starts by saying, oh, the good is vague, I don't know what it is, but we push towards it, just like the earlier dialogues, which I presented in the order as best I know, and those are arranged thematically by scholars long before I've been around, because they think in ways, and there's differences of opinion and fights, that this is Plato's dialogues because of the themes and how he changes, and that's how they arrange these, and also with other sources of information and textual things. Aspects. Fancier, more academic word for things, yes. So Socrates debunks, of course, he goes around proving everybody wrong, you're cool, I mean me, then constructs an ideal model of the city, and starts in Book 2. The well-ordered city is compared to the well-ordered soul, or self. 3 faculties, oftentimes people don't mention. You know, a lot of the, I read an amazing book, again, in grad school, by a guy named Campbell. That doesn't tell you much by itself, spelled like the soup, but it is a book about the European, it was written in the 70s, it was influential decently, and then I don't know if it still is having its time in the sun, but I don't know how much any of that has been disproven at all. The loose argument here, though, is very something that people who are into cosmology or into Pythagoreanism or Egyptian stuff. I come from the Haight-Ashbury, and there's a lot of New Agey stuff around there and out here in the East Bay. A lot of times I have mentioned with Pythagoras, I mentioned in that video, a lot of times what people think is mystical ancient Egyptian knowledge sometimes turns into Pythagoras, and that Pythagoras is not necessarily not Egyptian, it's hard to know. One of the things that draws all of that together, and it is remarkably similar across the Indo-European languages, and then Eurasia, Africa, and then the Americans are kind of, the Americas and the Mayans and the Aztecs are somewhat like this. One of the things that I learned about that is really remarkable that people talked about in the 70s and then sometimes mention but don't always is that you can actually see in Buddhist monuments and stupas in Tibet, and then you look at Western French cathedrals, you will find that people have across human cultures symbolized the elements in with basic shapes. So think about the pyramids, fire and light, and that fire looks triangular at the top. Now, would the Aztecs need to talk to the Egyptians or aliens to know that fire is triangular? No. It is remarkable, however, and this is where sometimes aliens and people speculate here, beyond my speculation. Speculation is fine for me, not speculative, dismissively, as some people say, but it's a little too speculative without so much for me that there's, because I haven't talked to aliens or God about any of this last week. We had other fish to fry, you know, as one fries a small fish with the Taoists. But other than that, it does look like Egypt, Sumer, and then following that, a lot of Eurasia, Africa, possibly, and even in Tibetan things, and then in China, etc., in Eurasia, you do find that fire is often symbolized triangularly. Air is often symbolized in different ways, but then you have sometimes, I guess in the Tibetan stuff, it's sort of a almost an Islamic kind of shape, but then you often have water is circular and then earth is square. Now, if you look at earth and sand or dirt, you will often see little pieces of rock that break off with square-ish edges. So minerals have square-ish edges. So people and water and pools of water look roundish on the edges, yes? So this would not have taken aliens or even contact between the Americas and Asia, across the Asian land bridge boats, all etc. The Tahitians get into Hawaii, and that's where the Hawaiians come from, with the stars, etc. It does look like humanity likes to symbolize things, like simple symbols, would come up with symmetrical shapes often that are pleasing to the eye, often transculturally, although I'm not going to make that hard argument, nor does it have to be simple shapes or are simply pleasing transculturally, but symmetrical shapes are often, and simple shapes are symmetrical shapes you could come up with easily if you had enough time screwing around and drawing things and doing things and seeing what is pleasing to the eye. Across human cultures, simple shapes often arise. They are often used to symbolize elements. Given that, it is extraordinary to see that a lot of times when people say New Age metaphysical things, and that's even 1800 spiritualism and things, you can see in some ways they are drawing on Pythagoreanism, and that's somewhat drawing on Egyptian stuff, and that is somewhat like Indian stuff. There was a book in the 70s I found long ago called India and Egypt, and they point out stuff like that in that book. And that was written in the early 70s, I think 1970, I found in the Berkeley stacks at some point. That fire's triangular for Indians and for Greeks, and then people talk about that in anthropology and such. I'm not an architecture person, and in fact, I'm not a languages person, and I'm a philosophy guy. But in covering Indian and Chinese thought, it is very interesting to point out, and I don't see a lot of people seem to know this. We don't have to make anything harder out of this than exactly the pragmatics as I'm putting it. But what Plato is doing, Plato's Republic and the Timaeus happen to be some of the central places you can see this in Greek thought, which is why it is important for me to double up and point this out here. This may be my silly interpretation, and yet I share it with some others. Is that it's not necessarily aliens or metaphysical reality, but from a pragmatic perspective, you do see human beings sharing these systems of observation and of symbolizing elements as basic shapes. This even gets into Zen, where you'll see like a triangle, a square, a circle, and this does seem like Plato is talking about the workers are a stomach desire people, the chest and the heart and the air. Timaeus says all of this in the next time. He talks about the organs of the body, and they talk about the organs in the stomach in the Republic wanting something. It looks like your body is a totem pole. This is all between the lines, but it's in the ancient world in India and Greece enough that you could call this misinterpretation, but in fact there's enough of this between the lines and enough other texts that we can say not everyone in Greece or India thought this way, but the Kundalini and the stacks of the Republic line up enough that I am not telling you anything metaphysical about reality or the human body or brain, as much as I am telling you that in India and Greece and other cultures, they line up the organs up the spine because they do ancient anatomy and cut you open and find stuff. The eyes are associated with light. The tongue is associated with food and dirt and water and the material down in the stomach. It does look like the cosmos stacks up fire, air, earth, water, or water, earth, depending on different systems. So you have heaviest. The periodic table is still to this day lightest to heaviest of elements. And that is not just that they whipped the periodic table out and then ignoring all previous culture, is that there was the sciences and the scienzias, and there was the developing all of that from Neoplatonism and Aristotelianism of the Middle Ages, and in Islam with the algebra and the European cultures and the Chinese technologies and gunpowder and stuff. And as all that drifted into Europe and people were into masonry and a lot of other interesting esoteric things, they ended up discovering what we now know in the modern sciences in ways such that I believe Lavoisier, I'm maybe a Swiss chemist, was trying to figure out that he was trying to prove that air is a basic element, and then screwed around and accidentally separated it into what he called fire air, which we actually know as oxygen. He ended up separating what he thought was an inseparable element because apparently he wanted to prove air, earth, water, almost like the Airbender, series. He wanted to show that these Pythagorean, Empedoclean, Platonic elements were real, and he ended up screwing that up. And then we have the modern periodic table, but it's still from lighter to heavier of elements, which is in the Islamic, European, and Eurasian, etc. tradition, and that's because we still model things that way. I have seen before, some people actually want to remodel the periodic table and make it more of a spiral, and as of yet that hasn't settled in, and I know next to nothing about that, and I would invite, of course, if you know more about the periodic table, you almost certainly do than I do, and you aren't aware that maybe they want, people may want to remodel that better in the future. Think about how that's still lightest to heaviest of elements. There's a big crag in the middle. Berkelium Americanum was invented in this town, and they sort of temporarily exist, and there's a big crag kind of in the middle. And all that has been the model somewhat since the late 1700s, early 1800s. All of that is strangely still lightest to heaviest of elements, and you find fire, kind of triangular, water, air is kind of more circular-ish fluid, and then you have earth is square. You find that in the order of a Tibetan stupa with the Buddhist eyes famously painted on it. And you find those sorts of symbolism in Christian cathedrals. It's because of nothing more metaphysical for me or involved with aliens or other beings, as much as humanity symbolized these different elements. And you find that portrayed in the Republic and the Timaeus. It's sad that that's actually part of the history of science, and what I do believe, and others have said, we're just people are embarrassed by all that now, so they just clip moments out of the Republic, like the cave, and they sort of are like, oh, Americans have a republic. Plato had a republic, he said. Therefore, he's like us, sort of, or modern white Americans, kind of, and Western culture, which is very much a creation of the Cold War. Very much Western, I mean the phrase Western culture and sort of modern whiteness is very much during the Cold War. And the Russians are sitting there saying, we're more Plato, and Plato's Republic is a communist place than anybody. Plato's Republic is kind of communist. And the Americans are saying, no, we're Western. And by the way, we're science. And it's almost as if people are embarrassed by the Timaeus. So we clip little moments out in America. I'm not sure. I'd have to study up how Russia studies Plato, actually, or did in the Soviet Union. That'd be a fun video as heck. But the Russians, with their Cyrillic language, always looked at themselves as more Greek, as do the Germans than others. But the Americans, we get to be Greek and, I guess, be ignorant about the rest. And so Plato's Republic is relevant, but the Timaeus is not. If you read these two texts together, which is a lot of what I got in grad school, you have a lot of the heart and soul and the totem pole of Neoplatonism, which for medieval Muslims and Christians was human thought and science and scientia, essentially. And, yes. Sebait in the Egyptian, I'm blanking on the Arabic. But, so you have here and I come from the Haight-Ashbury. People take Plato, they take Pythagoras, they say it's ancient Egyptian stuff, and it sort of is, and Plato in the Timaeus says, let's imitate the Egyptian priests and build a society like that, which would have been controversial to say in Athens. And they're learning geometry, measuring squares as the base of a pyramid, with triangles as the side of a pyramid, with Thales, going to Egypt, coming back, with Pythagoras, supposedly, according to Diogenes Laertius, going to Egypt and coming back. There are many Afrocentric thinkers who have said a thing or two about this you had better believe in the 70s and onward, because it looks like there's a lot of connections here between Africa and Europe and all of that, when they would not have simply, maps aside and such. It's all a bunch of cultures again, and they, more so for them, and they are definitely symbolizing these things in ways, and Plato says, let's be like the Egyptians. All that is my run up here to getting into the Republic, because I definitely want to frame the Republic not as we are going to focus on Book 1 and Book 2 in the cave. I have had people say, what about the rest of the Republic? There's a lot of that, and we are going to be actually moving through Plato's dialogues, because all of Plato's dialogues show his development, and when you focus only on the Republic, that is a very American and very American Cold War way of examining it, and it does seem like it's reinforcing the idea, clipping pieces out, like Plato's a Democrat, or a Republican, dare I say, here in Berserkly Town, is that, we're not, there's all different types, all different places. Yes, that's the demographics. But, all of that, essentially, and the Soviet Union always think they're the Republic, much more so of Plato. Hey, look at us, and look at this. That's essentially, well, as always, who gets to what philosophy is unfortunately a social and a political thing. So that said, and I'll have a moment or two to mention the Soviet Union as we go through here, let's keep going here. The ways that the Greeks are presented by different cultures is a very fascinating subject in and of itself. I have interwoven critical sides of all of that into all of the lectures if you listen. Or if you don't even, you'll find it anyway. So in the first book of the Republic, Socrates talks to a bunch of people, to interlocutors, which is a term meaning inner speakers. It's used for additional participants in a debate you're writing into a text. Counterpositions for Socrates disprove. We can do that if you say, and it's a good idea for an essay. Yes, you gotta write essays if you're in the classes. Well, an opponent might say, or while a critic might say something here, it's always good to bounce your ideas back and forth, of course, and try to preemptively head off at the pass your opponent and say, well, somebody would say here I can empathize, but at the same time, let me balance that back out. Modern philosophers such as Nietzsche and Wittgenstein use this device very often. Those are two of my modern favorites. Somebody says, and often they'll just throw something in quotes and start at you, and you have to notice they're putting it in scare quotes, as we say in America, because you won't necessarily know they're telling you another opinion, and you have to be careful. All of these, actually, philosophies, they make sure and note when they're saying a view that's not theirs, that they are then that they're kind of mocking or saying, and then they're like, but here, In the first book, Socrates is questioning others like the original pre-Platonic Socrates. He shows everyone is unclear while he doesn't answer anything himself. And the Meno says he's a stingray that stuns his opponents, and Socrates says he himself is stunned. He stuns himself. The first interlocutor, I can speak pretty one day, Polemarchus, argues that justice is paying debts, helping friends, and harming enemies. Remember that Meno argues very much the same position, and he paid Gorgias to learn it. Socrates says that in some situations, just like that, helping friends and harming enemies is wrong. And he does, in the Meno, he says, because good is the same for everybody. And he does very much say something like that, although here he is actually compartmentalizing and putting a nice Hindu-like caste system. As many have noted, Aldous Huxley makes Brave New World, thinking of the Hindu caste system and of the Republic very much along the lines of the Campbell book and material I was just mentioning and going on and nerding out about. Because you can see the Hindu caste system is actually very similar to Plato's Republic. That is not an accident. That would be because speculative thinkers might be thinking, hey, let's line up humanity with the elements and the orders and the organs of the body like humanity would be their models and what they can see. The seasons, the organs of the body, how does that line up and stack in the cosmos as best as they can scientia it before the Latin? So Socrates says, in some situations, helping friends and harming enemies is wrong. Suppose your friend, only some though. Socrates did sign up for the army and go fight against the enemy. He was not just, well, everybody has everything, man. So he's like, but sometimes, he doesn't say always. Sometimes, helping friends, hey, I need a sword, I'm all angry at this guy. Oh, here's a sword. Nope, that's not good. Sometimes you're, and again, going around and poisoning all of the enemy, even if they haven't done anything to you that day, that's not always good at all. So it is wrong to help your friend when they want something terrible, and it's wrong to harm your enemies when that is bad, and and he goes back and forth. Socrates is particularly opposed to the view that one should seek to harm in the name of justice, in fact, as it would be much better to benefit everyone than harm enemies. So he does sort of speak a little bit communally, let's all come down to the water and the common good. He does definitely, structuring the city, hold out for, and there's people you have to hold outside, and be at war with in the city. Similar to the Symposium, where he says the highest love is concerned with the benefit of all, not attachment to those one is attracted to. You have here similar thematic early Socrates, which he doesn't entirely lose. So the second interlocutor, the famous Thrasamakis, is irritated with Socrates' questioning, and he says and demands that Socrates give his own account of what justice is. Now, I imagine Plato himself, and he saw others debating, even if how much ever he spoke up himself before this play and talked to people, I imagine a lot. He certainly had somebody, when he was more so a Socrates Heraclitean possibly, say, well, then you give your account, and he saw himself or others be like, well, I don't really know, we kind of intuitionistically try to talk pretty and push towards the good, via rhetoric or action or otherwise. So Socrates, of course, what does he do? He asks Thrasamakis to give his own views, and Thrasamakis falls for it. He says, oh, well, here's mine, which, of course, Thrasamakis will be like, no, you jerk, but he is going to return there. And that's the turn to Book 2 of the Republic, and more Pythagoreanism a whole lot for this and the next dialogue through. This and the hangover day and the recovery next day. So Socrates asks Thrasamakis to give his own views, and Thrasamakis argues that justice is the good of the stronger. Might makes right. Now, he doesn't mean this is good. The Greek skeptics say life is fair and life is unfair. It's sort of like life is neither good nor bad, but might makes right in the world, kind of Darwinian, and a little bit here of Nietzsche, although all of these, Darwin and Nietzsche and other people, wouldn't say, and that's just wonderful and I like it. But Thrasamakis, as a more cynical, pessimistic guy, says that I can see history. Schopenhauer, who's a bit more Heraclitean, and early Socrates is decently Heraclitean. Schopenhauer said the history of a village is the history of an empire. Humanity does not change. We do not learn from history. We are humanity. I would not be able to teach you all this if that wasn't somewhat true, would I? So, actually, what are the cops? What's the system? What's communism across the waters? Well, it's the good of the stronger, and that's what humanity is. Insofar as we're ever cynical about humanity, politics aside or otherwise, yeah, the good of the stronger, might makes right. That's very instinctive for humanity, ain't it? Along with Darwin. So Athens had been conquered at this point, reconquered a lot, and it was starting to slide into decline, which is great periods for philosophers to be revered as wise guys who are trying to turn you back to the path. Just like city-states of Ionia earlier, and many rulers and forms of government had come and gone. Recently, Thrasamakis, like Socrates, does not claim to know what the good is in and of itself, like Socrates. But he is more skeptical and pessimistic. He's not an intuitionist, well, we just push for the good. He's like, no, the bad is here and here to stay. We're not pushing for the good at all, you chump. What is that? Tell me. Throw down. He argues the powerful get to impose their own views on people as to what is good and what is bad, practicing their own form of justice as they see fit. Now, that is decently the world, and as Socrates will admit, sure, he ultimately says, but it doesn't last. Confucius actually gives a very similar position in China, but that wouldn't last. And he is doing that, like in India, others, because they think if you're not in tune with the tuning fork of reality, if you don't have your ducks in a row, a la the Republic and the Timaeus spell out, as is why they then go on to do this. Why would Socrates go on about the form of the city and and then as an analogy, and then go on from there to listen to Timaeus go on and on about the cosmos, and yeah, that's shaped like the soul, like the city, like the cosmos, because you have soul, mind, soul, self, you have self, society, cosmos, mind, body, self, society, cosmos, 3, 3, 3 as 1, 2, 3. And while Indian stuff is decently sort of Trinitarian in triangles and threes, Hegel tries to put all of history into a waltz step, in his work, in a maddening forest of German that's for many impenetrable. Socrates doesn't tell us exactly what he's doing here, and neither does Plato, but he seems to be walking us from Heraclitus to something like Trinitarian Pythagoreanism, which is way into triangles and the Tetractys, and the 10 is a pyramid, a la the Egyptians. While this is similar to pre-Platonic Socrates, or possibly or early Socrates for Plato, early Platonic Socrates, not claiming to know the form of the good in itself, Thrasamakis is a pessimist. He is skeptical of striving for the good itself after so many wars and tyrants. Socrates believes there is such a thing as good, virtue, and justice, even if we mortals do not ever understand it entirely, and perhaps you and I don't ever. And yet, I'm doing these talks. Hopefully you get something out of them. Thrasamakis does not explicitly argue that there is no good in itself to strive for, but his relativistic position is pessimistic rather than optimistic. You can, in fact, from this, say there is optimistic skepticism. Pragmatism is something like that, and optimistic often in the name of science. Science more for pragmatism, often American pragmatism, which American philosophy tends to be pro-science, both analytic positivism and pragmatism. More science means more good. For Schopenhauer and for existentialism, no. Watch Killing of a Sacred Deer. No, more technology means a bunch of narcissistic dill holes. It doesn't mean anything good. The history of we're humanity here to stay. At least that's the myth, at least. Whether or not we're quite the deer. Madeir, madame, and frankly, yes. And frankly, I don't give madame. Yes? But on to other matters of might makes right, oddly and terribly in the world. So, Thrasamakis does not say I know, but he says I'm not into that you know, or we can push towards it. Whichever ruler, just or unjust by our own position, gets to impose whatever form of justice they please on others. There's weird images of Ocasio-Cortez going around the internet right now, oddly to me, without any progress or direction in sight. In modern European thought, the French post-structuralist thinker Foucault, also called a postmodernist, says that much of the same about institutions. Not that they're bad or good, but that power is power. We have to fight the fascists in all of us because human power informs or human power informs, good and bad, back and forth. As having the terrible meme which uses Foucault and the mangled Japanese subtitles, all your subjectivities belong to discursive regimes of power. Yes? It's just discursive regimes of power as far as the eye can see, children. What gives? Well, politics. And again, Socrates' daimon, his inner mind, told him to stay out of it. Did he know? Here he gets in... If his daimon told him to stay out of politics, he really should have turned left at Albuquerque rather than turn right and into Book 2 of the Republic. A third interlocutor, Glaucon, joins Thrasamakis. So Thrasamakis is going to split, but Glaucon is going to stay. Here's the device. We can see it right here. Thrasamakis symbolizes the people who will not listen to Socrates and goes off and like, nope, nuts to you. Glaucon has a bit of faith, with, George Michael, possibly in the men's room. And essentially, he's going to say, no, I'll stick around. You know what I mean? I wouldn't there. But that there's the threat of punishment. That he says, well, wait a minute. He says, without the threat of punishment, nobody would do good. But he is sort of like, well, might makes right, but then it forces good, right? So he's somewhat on the fence. But he's also going to stick around while Thrasamakis pieces out. Glaucon is going to say, well, I'm going to be Thrasamakis, but I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. So he gets to be Thrasamakis converted and won over at the end, and Thrasamakis doesn't get to see the light, remains a skeptic and a pessimist, and he gets outside the gates to thrash his teeth. So Socrates argues against them that but one's going to stay, one's going to leave, that the strong will corrupt themselves if they only act for their own interests and not for the good of the whole. Now that's actually kind of true. Again, life's fair and unfair. If you do act like a tyrannical jerk, Machiavelli says you don't want to be that guy in Cocaine Queen Pin with Griselda Blanca or otherwise, because you have to viciously hold power and then you have a tragic fate a la Agamemnon and Greek tragedy. This is a Greek play. Do any of the audience know of a Greek tragedy or two? I think they do, This is not so funny a comedy here, to not be tragic, but this is certainly an audience that has heard of a Greek tragedy or two before. They've probably been around the block of the Agora. So, essentially, or possibly up to the Acropolis and look down on it. So, and Plato himself looks down on the marketplace. So... He is quite, yes, the bear rather than the bull, as it were. So Thrasamakis leaves. He is angered and unconvinced by Socrates' arguments. This is end of Book 1. Nothing has been resolved, and everyone, including Socrates, is unsatisfied with the results of the debate so far. Starting with Book 2 of the Republic, Socrates now begins to argue for ideas which many believe those to be of Plato himself, because it's not like the earlier dialogues in Plato's Socrates. Glaucon and Adiamantus, who has joined him as Thrasamakis departed, wish to hear Socrates give his own views, which he does by questioning them and leading them to answers which satisfy everybody. Kind of leading, like the Meno, like the slave boy he leads, to geometry. This is, which I have in the notes. I have these moments where I say something and I'm like, ooh, an insight, and then I'm like, and I wrote that down. It is justifiable to say that Plato believes that there is a true form of justice and virtue, and we know it already, even as we have concealed it from ourselves in ignorance, as he says in the Meno. These people already know they know, but they don't know that they know. Glaucon challenges Socrates to prove that justice is better than injustice. Because injustice seems so attractive to so many, why would people, you might ask in this day and age, do what is just if they could do injustice without punishment? Some kind of immunity, or other. One of the unfortunate, I'll just stick in here, a little weird critical aside, one of the other things I learned over the years is, oddly enough, would you rather be in a more so, communist country where they're constantly stringing up their old leaders and being like, well, that was the jerk, not like me though, and you'd rather be down with that? Or would you rather be in a capitalist country where almost no senators have almost ever gone to jail for anything? Do you think a president or a senator is going to go to jail for next week for anything, kids? Right now, I would bet not. Why? Well, because we don't send our leaders to jail here. That's some corrupt communist country where they're constantly like, no, our old people, they're like the Gang of Four last week. No. Yeah, that's Mao's wife. That's a bunch of people. Like, no, in America, no one ever goes to jail plenty. Like, so it ain't just qualified immunity, for this or that badge. It's presidents don't go. Apparently, one of the last senators I read in a cartoon comic book about the Constitution. So that's a source and a half. One of the last senators to ever go to jail was in the late 1800s for shooting a man having an affair with his wife out in front of the Senate building in D.C. So if that was one of the last senators to go to jail in America, well, would you rather be in a communist country where they lie to you and they string up the last bunch of powerful and say, we're the people again? Or would you rather be in a place where nobody goes to jail, where all the money's flowing through the world through here? What do you think? And that's because nobody ever murders or bribes anybody here, inappropriately at all, because nobody's been to jail, And I got large sections of the Brooklyn Bridge I can Airbnb to you. Please, just email me with all your credit card information. Please don't, I'm not involved in crimes, Do I have time for politics? No, I have time for Socrates' daimon and talking to myself in the garden here. So what you got, and again, that is an odd thing. Lots of weird, opposites within opposites. Both duck-rabbit sides, well, quite human. If a mighty warrior, as Thrasamakis has argued, could capture a city and do whatever he likes without fear, which would be capitalism, communism, everybody, good night, everybody, a lot to the cynic in world history today. After Auschwitz, of course, both the capitalists and the communists are convincing you they're not fascists. And both the capitalists and the communists point to each other and say, guess who the fascists are? Them people. Not ourselves, though. Sure am glad about that, And there's more money here, of course. So heck. And again, I will not preach to you anything beyond that. I'm just going to leave that right there, ain't I? So Socrates has committed to himself to the position that if somebody grabs for themselves up the capitalist or communist or anything or other, and in fact that is relevant to bring up with the Republic because they are going to Socrates is going to argue private property should be somewhat abolished in the higher orders at least, which means Socrates is going to argue we should have something like a commune and communal property in order to get the evil out, which makes Socrates here and Plato sound decently communist if it seems like I'm bringing up communism too much. Obviously, we're rounding off the edges for the popular presentation, but this is, we should have more popular presentation of these things if you get my drift. We're all afraid of history and the big bad wolf, because we don't do enough history, it would seem. So Socrates is saying, tyrant won't last long. Well, anybody who doesn't like the Soviet Union, didn't like the Soviet Union or capitalism or what have you, well, how the heck does all that last, along with Thrasamakis, for as long as he does here? If might doesn't make right in the world, then how do our opponents, whoever you are and we ain't, how do they last so long in the world then? I do like to mention to my students, a lot of ancient people do say, and it's true, if you're stressed out and a jerk in life, a lot of times you don't live longer, you have problems. But life is fair and unfair, and some people are serious jerks, have a lot of cats, and live forever. How does that happen? Well, Plato definitely is the oldest school. Well, no matter how many cats you have and feed, if you're a jerk, you should fall off. Old angry cat lady should have a stroke or two. Please don't, But I mean, Plato seems to think you'd have mind-body problems, just like modern academic philosophy. If you somehow did not, if you somehow were a jerk and kept all the golden dancing girls to yourself, which is actually what Confucius says, is no emperor, or local prince, don't do that. But Confucius is much more Republican than Plato, who is much more the communist, oddly, as I do like to argue. Confucius is much more Republican dad than Plato, who is a tradition, who seems weirdly, to Confucius anyway, he seems like Moza of ancient China. Very much the communal guy, and like an Israeli. So kibbutz, Gesundheit. So we have here that Socrates says to the remaining two interlocutors who stay around, at least more than one in Glaucon, that he did not feel he had convincingly refuted Thrasamakis, and that perhaps they should continue to debate and figure out what justice actually is. This is the turn from Socratic questioning to Platonic ideal forms. And one of the major interesting grad school problems with Plato, and Plato is not only do you learn it more in grad school if you can, and focus on Greek philosophy at all, which I'm a religion guy and history of religion and history of philosophy guy, so I did this kind of stuff as the background many kind of ignore. This raises very interesting question. So how do we know what any of this might makes right and then right is right if this is all back and forth? And unfortunately, it is at this place where Socrates starts to carve out the three parts of the city as a model. I had a student recently argue it's not about the city at all. And I didn't mention, no, you're right, it's more about the self. That's primary, but it is also about the city because if you know the Timaeus, it's about the cosmos, and that forms the three of the threes. So yeah, it is, once you read the Timaeus and you put it along with it, it is about the city also, but not entirely. It is about the self, and it is a model for the self, and that's what it is in the beginning as proposed. La cucaracha. Again, for the construction workers across the street, which is why I have the windows closed, and yet, again, can we hold together human culture? Well, Plato couldn't, on one or two islands under tyrants or not. So, in this republic, and the economy. So as Plato interjects his own ideas into his dialogues, the opposition becomes weaker and weaker. In the dialogue that follows the Republic, the Timaeus, which concerns the order of the cosmos beyond and above the order of the good individual and the just city, the text becomes a virtual monologue, without much room for interlocutors and dissenting opinions. And then I don't cover Plato's laws at all in this class or otherwise much. That is actually stuff I do need to get to plenty at some day and get into it. I know several other of Plato's dialogues, though, and I work a lot through that. Plato's laws, it's not much of a dialogue. It's just, again, and it's not Socrates, I'm pretty sure. It's somebody else lecturing at length, and it's not much of a play or a dialogue. This would be horrible to sit there and watch, unless it was like pantomime by puppets or something, aside from the actors. Because, yeah, perhaps shadow puppets in a cave of some sort, like a theater, or some kind of camera. So, we have here Aristotle, Plato's student, argued that skeptics, such as Heraclitus, are mere destroyers, who are no better than plants. While Xenophanes, Heraclitus, and Socrates were optimistic about skepticism, pushing for greater truth even though truth cannot be obtained entirely. Zeno was more pessimistic about human understanding, it seems, arguing like Parmenides that any attempt to separate and differentiate results in differentiate, split with an axe, a la Anaxagoras said we couldn't, results in contradiction and misunderstanding. Excuse me. Plato, like his student Aristotle, seems to have become more pessimistic, like Thrasamakis himself, about a lack of substance in Socrates' argument, perhaps, though Plato does not share Thrasamakis' pessimism about truth itself. Plato, unlike the original Socrates, has become pessimistic about skepticism here, whether or not the original Socrates ever did. Because he seems to have, in Plato's own words and text and dialogue, seemed to have pieced out himself, seems to have chosen to drink hemlock and stay around in prison rather than bribe the guards, while being rather Heraclitean and suggesting he's going to go annoy Homer and Hesiod in the Elysian fields, in a similar manner. So oddly did early Socrates take this turn. Well, later Plato did, we're sure, and it doesn't seem Socrates, according to Plato's own, did. So this is personified in the character of Thrasamakis, who is pessimistically skeptical about power and its ability to achieve genuine justice. All right. So that said, there is a whole lot more, actually, about Plato and the noble lie, and as I thought, we are actually at the turn into from book 1 to book 2 of the Republic, which is what I hoped for. And if I talked at length, which I unfortunately did, I would find us there anyway. So next time here, we are not going to do the Timaeus. I am a liar, but then again, it is a noble lie of sorts, because we're going to do another on book 2 of the Republic. And then while there's a lot more in the Republic, we are, as said, going to move to the Timaeus, where we frame Plato's Republic and the tripartite soul and city-state in terms of the tripartite elemental cosmos, along with Pythagoreanism. And Timaeus the Pythagorean will lecture us at length 2 times from now. 1 over. Jam every other day. Eom. So, and yams are good for you. So, I am what I am, and hopefully, again, you stack your ducks in a proper row with a soul, a city-state, and a cosmos and a cosmos together. And I will see you when I see you with Book 2 of the Republic.